Teachers who are older or who might be vulnerable to the coronavirus can't or won't go back to the classroom. Teacher shortages will be exacerbated when schools actually finally do return. At what point will we all realize that educating kids at home is not expensive, complicated, or something that can be done by so-called experts? I'm Dr. Duke, she's Katie, and this is the Dr. Duke Show. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Dr. Duke Show, the only program that keeps you educated on the craziness impacting K-12 classrooms and college campuses around the world. Today, we're looking at the potential for an even greater teaching shortage in America as many older and high-risk teachers debate whether they will be safe when schools reopen, public schools reopen, after the COVID-19 lockdown. And, you know, this is a big deal, and I go back to my tease there. Think about how complicated this is. I mean, with all due respect to teachers, I'm a teacher, Katie has been a teacher. Teaching is a noble profession, but a 4-year degree that allows you to teach elementary school kids does not make you a rocket scientist. It does not give you some deeper insight. Half of your education degree is learning all that stupid theoretical crap from the education professors. It doesn't mean anything. Real teachers, if you're somebody who's taught in a classroom, you know I'm telling you the truth. Teaching is something you've got in here, and either you're good at it or you're not. All the education classes in the world will not make a good teacher out of somebody who's not. And so when you ask yourself this question, Mom and Dad, what really is it that we're sending your kids for? As we'll see later in the show today, sadly, it's daycare, right? If the American public schools have become extremely, extremely, extremely expensive daycare operations. They don't do a good job educating. They don't do a good job preparing your kids for the next level. What they do is they socialize your kids. Imagine your 9th grader, right, at the public school. He's effectively the 9th grade version of what a 4-year-old would be, right? He's being socialized. He's being sexualized. He's being put into certain boxes. He's being contained. His time is being regulated. He's been given lunch, right? Maybe if he's lucky, a couple minutes to run around the schoolyard, and then he's sent home to you. But these public schools are not turning out educated citizens and Americans. You're paying a lot of money, Mom and Dad, for daycare.
And now with the whole thing with COVID going on and schools are shut down, but they will reopen. What does that look like? We've been discussing that for weeks on end now. Finally, someone is actually asking, well, what about the teachers? Because we've been focusing on how the school buildings will look and the bus situation and lunch and the students and all this. But they kind of have left out in a way, like the teachers in terms of their health, not just the teachers and what they're teaching. But they're basically figuring out, okay, if our school buildings are opening, how many teachers and staff members actually won't feel safe coming into school? And what is that going to then look like? Because then we already know teacher shortages supposedly across the country. What becomes of that, and who's going to be so-called teaching your students?
Yeah, and we've done stories about how the students are dwindling, right? That there's a poll coming up. We'll talk about polls next week that show that fewer and fewer kids plan to go to college. Want to ask this question about the public schools too. There are also some data out there that we'll look at again next week that suggests that a fair number of kids, maybe as high as 10 to 15%, will not return to the public schools on the basis of this. And then we have a teacher shortage. No one's asking this question. Given all of this chaos in the public schools, how many kids will continue being education majors? How many majors in the colleges right now will drop this? How many who were considering it, seeing this complete aggravation, this cluster bleep, that on a federal level, a state level, a local level, why get yourself involved with this, especially for the money you're going to make? So you're going to see the effects of COVID continue to destroy what's left of public schooling for years to come after this.
And the thing to really consider, too, is knowing that according to the data already out there, about 1 in 5 of our nation's public school teachers are 55 or older.
Yep.
So if you have them scared to come back, or hey, they're almost at retirement age anyway, even more leaving and no one coming in to fill in behind them. I mean, among the whole other thing about not having educated teachers to teach, but the fact that we just won't have them at
And
all.
I don't think that if you're 20% of your teachers are that close to retirement, you're not bringing in enough teachers to keep growing. They're shrinking big time. This is going to be, again, what I'm trying to tell you, Mom and Dad, this is going to be a chronic illness for public schools. Your public schools were on life support to begin with. Life support, the only life support the public schools had was all of our money we keep dumping into the failed schools. They've been on life support for about 20 years. Now add to that this. You got to ask yourself, is homeschooling or finding alternative schooling, is it not the only moral thing to do with regards to your own children? If you want them to have a life where they're looked after, where they can take care of themselves, where they can create their own wealth, where they have options, where they can look after a family. Is that what you want? Kids who value the American experience, who understand what it is, kids who participate civically in the governing of a republic? Because you see you're not getting that now.
Well, what we do see, at least at this very moment, is we do have school districts who are now bringing the kids back, at least for daycare. At least the purpose of that. A San Diego County School District is one of the first in California to start bringing the students back to campus, not for full-time school, but for childcare. Cajun Valley Union School District has been offering free childcare to families with essential workers since April 27th at Chase Avenue Elementary School. So every day from 6:30 in the morning to 6 at night, staff are enforcing physical distancing for students. They're doing health temperature checks. Basically, you see the kids are by themselves, 6 feet apart with their masks, eating alone, having to jump rope because they can't play with other students.
And listen to what she just said. We can't have your kids in the public school to be taught. We can't have them there to learn. If we send your kids to the public schools and take precautions and try to keep them distant in order to teach them something, that's a no-go. But if daycare is necessary, we'll take your kids. We'll take your kids for daycare purposes, not for educational purposes. And that seems to say a lot about where the focus of the schools is.
Okie dokie. Moving on to Harvard, where backlash works sometimes. A few weeks ago, we talked about the anti-homeschooling conference that was to be held at Harvard this summer. And technically, this was a invite-only event called Homeschooling Summit, Problems, Politics, and Prospects for Reform. And the purpose of it was to discuss child rights in connection with homeschooling in the United States with a focus on problems of educational deprivation and child maltreatment that too often occur under the guise of homeschooling in a legal environment of minimal or no oversight. Well, this event basically drew the ire of all people in basically common sense land. And so now this event was scheduled for June 18th and 19th, and it has mysteriously been postponed until 2021. And there has been no formal announcement, but Campus Reform actually reached out to the speakers who were invited to this, and they all confirmed that this event was at least canceled for now.
Right, and I'm sure to cover their Harvard Brahmin behind, the Brahmins at Harvard and the yard, to cover their Grey Poupon butts, decided that the COVID is a great way to postpone this, and I think they still want to have it. I think they figure a year from now everybody will have forgotten about it.
And then they'll just do it.
No, we won't forget about this. And notice what the premise was. Can you read the title one more time?
Homeschooling Summit, Problems, Politics, and Prospects for Reform.
In other words, the overriding assumption is that homeschool is bad. Yeah. How do we fix it? How do we use it as a political tool? How do we reform it and eliminate it altogether? This is the kind of thinking that these Brahmins have. They're looking at you, Mom and Dad, despite all the failure of the public school. Again, let me lay the scene for you. Despite all the failures of your public schools that these Brahmins understand, right? They can't educate your kids. They claim they don't have enough money. There aren't enough teachers, right? There's all sorts of problems. And what are they focused on at Harvard? Not reforming public schools. There is no conference at Harvard how to fix our broken public schools. Oh, and by the way, they're concerned about your kids being abused at home because there's no oversight, as if Mom and Dad don't count as oversight, right? Only somebody with a stupid 4-year degree in education counts as oversight, or somebody with a Harvard diploma. Notice what they're not telling you. Yeah, there's a possibility that parents can abuse their kids. That's any parent could, right? Child abuse happens. But to argue that because your kids are being homeschooled, homeschool kids, moms and dads, are more likely to do it, which is what they're implying, is BS. And they're ignoring the fact that we saw a couple weeks ago a survey that says about 10% of 60 million 60 million public school kids report having been molested or abused in their public school campuses, right? So is that 600,000 or 6 million?
6 million.
6
oh, yeah,
million.
it's 60 million.
10% of 600. Yeah, 10% of 60 million is 6. That's 6 million public school kids, more or less, who have claimed abuse at the hands of public school teachers or administrators. Where's the reform? Could you just see it? Let's get a big university to host a conference, right? And that conference will be public schooling, right? Politics, reform, and remaking. Never in a million years would that go.
Of course not. So everyone remembers, the co-organizer of what this summit, homeschooling summit, was supposed to be is the controversial speaker Elizabeth Bartholet, who's a professor of law and faculty director of Harvard Law School's Child Advocacy Program. And she was actually just interviewed, and we did a story on this, in Harvard Magazine for a story called Risks of Homeschooling. And in that piece, she said, "We have an essentially unregulated regime in the area of homeschooling." And her reasons for wanting to ban homeschooling include the lack of regulations, setting standards on which parents are allowed to homeschool, the isolation of children, the absence of teachers who could act as, quote, mandated reporters, because that's what the teachers are supposed to be, mandated reporters, and the threat it creates that will ultimately jeopardize America's democracy.
And keep in mind, Mom and Dad, whenever a kid is abused some way on a public school campus, what do you ever hear from them, right? It's a personnel issue. These are these mandated reporters, right?
My favorite quotes.
These public school teachers are so looking out for your kids that when they are in numbers way higher than what's going on in private and homeschooling, way higher. There aren't even 6 million homeschool families in this country, right? There are 6 million public school kids who claim that they've been harassed. And whenever these mandated reporters, these tried and true public servants whose job it is to look after the welfare of your kid, whenever they are abused on a college campus, public school campus, what do you get from the administration? It's a personnel issue. We can't discuss it.
You didn't get the voice as proper. We take the safety of your children very seriously, and we are looking into this matter to the extent that we can, and it is a personnel issue, so we are unable to comment further at this time.
Let me try
But assure
again.
us.
We at FU Public School have decided that this is a personnel issue, and you really don't have the right to know in order to protect the abuser's identity and civil rights. We at FU Public School say have a good day.
Now on to our next story. Here's a lesson for you. Don't fake hate crimes. So it seems that students really have not learned from this whole Jussie Smollett thing where you fake a hate crime. Anayeli Dominguez Pina is a 25-year-old grad student, or I guess now former grad student, at University of La Verne, which is a private institution charging $61,000 a year plus in tuition in La Verne, California, which is basically in the LA area. Well, she's facing felony and misdemeanor charges for allegedly faking 10 separate incidents of racist attacks or threats against her on her campus. And students and the campus community have rallied behind her, and now they all feel like they have egg on their face. So if you take a look at the photo that we have, a group of outspoken students there on the left, the caption says, "A group of outspoken students who are well known on campus for organizing anti-racism protests." Seen in the photo on left, Anayeli Dominguez Pina, a Mexican-American graduate student and vocal social justice campaigner. She has been instrumental in organizing numerous protests in the Decolonize ULV group she co-led. So the fact that she had allegedly these 10 racist incidents, you can see that she probably, did put them against herself.
Stories like this butter my buns. It just drives
Both buns?
me, butters my buns. It drives me mad. I mean, so let's see if we understand this. We've created a dysfunctional system in the universities where every single protest of any sort, every single story, claim, outrageous assertion from a minority on a college campus is treated like a federal offense. And when you find out, like you find out here, that it's all lies, generally, little to nothing happens. Now, she's actually facing some serious charges, but I will bet you my buttered buns and the pants that go on top of them, that will get pleaded down, that when it's all said and done, 2 words, Jussie Smollett, right? That's what's going to happen here.
Yeah, maybe.
That you here's my thing. If these so-called microaggressions that these kids are whining about, if they are as horrifying, somebody asked me about my hair. Somebody said to me, well, what country are you from? These little microaggressions that are now proof of colonialism and racism, if they're so horrible on college campuses, shouldn't you then punish draconianly anybody who fakes them? If they are so horrible to begin with, then people who horribly accuse them they're doing something just as bad, nay, worse, right? But no. And let me round this out. Professor Judy Holliday, Associate Professor of Writing, Gender, and Sexuality Studies.
Yes.
She told Campus Reform, that Peña's lies reflect just how bad the problem of racism is. So her lies, her willful, conscious lies, show that even though she wasn't being oppressed, she's oppressed. Quote, it was very distressing to hear that a student fabricated racist threats, especially as those threats did so much to damage the reputation of other individuals in the university. It was also distressing to think about the fact that racism in the United States is so profoundly a part of the lives of people of color that a student felt compelled to do something illegal and immoral to bring attention to the problem. You are the problem, Mrs. Holliday. You are the one who enabled her. Don't you blame me, and don't you blame Katie, and don't you blame the United States. You did it. You're the professor who feeds women like this day in and day out a daily barrage of nonsense. You take ownership. You should be the one who suffers the consequence for what she did.
This is what happens when he butters his buns. I'm just going to put it out there. So some of the things that apparently Ms. Peña did to have these racist attacks. One report said she was reportedly found bruised at the bottom of a stairwell, claiming that she had been beaten by a masked man, but denied medical assistance. Another, because she is 25, a grad student, and is living in the campus housing, found her parked car emitting smoke. Someone had tried to start a fire with a backpack inside the vehicle. The university canceled all the remaining classes that day, and the Laverne Police Department and the FBI stepped in to investigate this. And it all supposedly was her doing.
I think I said enough.
I think your buns are quite buttered.
Said enough. And look, every bleeding word of it is true.
Finally, it's time for some real education. J.R.R. Tolkien was a writer, poet, philologist, academic, and early pioneer of fantasy literature. Born in South Africa, he was a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford from 1925 to 1945 and Merton Professor of English Language and Literature from 1945 to 1959. He was a close friend of C.S. Lewis. They were both members of the informal literary discussion group known as the Inklings, and the great success of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings caused Tolkien to be popularly identified as the father of modern fantasy literature. In 2008, The Times ranked him 6th on a list of the 50 greatest British writers since 1945. Forbes actually ranked him the 5th top-earning dead celebrity in 2009.
Yes, of course, during 2009, we were still getting the fallout from the movies, but yeah, making a lot of bank after he's been dead since 1973, making a lot of bank. And the Lord of the Rings obviously is too huge and beautiful. We'll keep, over the years, you and I are together, we are together. We will keep bringing back quotes from books like The Lord of the Rings. I could only look at one today. But J.R.R. Tolkien he really more than anybody else put fantasy literature on the map. I mean, J.R.R., it's often been said that C.S. Lewis did a lot of things incredibly well. Lewis was a radio personality. He penned the Screw Tape Letters. He was a teacher. He was a science fiction writer. He did 1,000 things, Lewis, incredibly well. Tolkien, on the other hand, did one thing better than anyone else had ever done in the history of the world, and that is create a completely fleshed out mythological world, right? He didn't just write a story about hobbits and about men and elves and dwarves. Tolkien wrote the history of all of those groups of people. He created languages, functional languages for all those groups of characters. He even went back to the book of Genesis of Middle-earth and created gods and goddesses and an entire superstructure. No one in the history of the world had done so copiously what he had done. His world has depth upon depth upon depth to the point that his imaginative world is as multi-layered as our own. And for that, he deserves our everlasting admiration. Take one quote from the first book of the Lord of the Rings. It's where Gandalf, the great wise magician, who also was one of those gods, one of the Maiar, he is having a conversation with Frodo, who they're being stalked by Gollum, who wants the ring back. And at one point, Frodo says, it's too much. I just wish he were dead. Somebody ought to kill him. He deserves it. And Gandalf says, deserves it? I dare say he does. Sure he does. But many that live deserve death, and some who die deserve life. Can you give it to them, Frodo? Then do not be too eager to deal out death and judgment, for even the very wise cannot see all ends. And he goes on to say, with all of his foresight, right? He's a wizard, I suspect Gollum has a very important role to play yet. And the reality is that Gandalf was right. Kill the monster now and end that threat, and you would never have someone to guide you into Mordor to return the ring, which was necessary. A beautiful speculation from Tolkien, right? And I love the morality of that. It's very Christian, isn't it?
Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them, Frodo? Do not be too eager to deal out death and judgment. Even the very wise cannot see all ends.
And what I love think about the amoral Game of Thrones, where the Game of Thrones, it was all about sex and everything was morally relative. There was almost no virtue. Everybody was betraying everybody else. That can't hold a candle to a created world like the Lord of the Rings, which preserved and advanced morality, not tried to undercut it.
Well, that's going to do it for this Thursday. As always, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And if you have a question for our Friday Q&A, visit freedomproject.com/askduke or send us a nice message on social media. But we must wrap things up with our fun fact of the day. Actor Christopher Lee, who plays Saruman, it's Saruman the White, isn't it? In The Lord of the Rings, actually read the book once per year, beginning in 1954 when it was published, and he was the only cast or crew member to have ever actually met Tolkien.
Christopher Lee was also a James Bond-type spy in World War II. A remarkably varied, broad-minded man. Yes, and he's the only one to actually have looked Tolkien in the eye. And that's going to do it for this show. For Freedom Project, I'm Dr. Duke, she's Katie. And until next time, stay educated, my friends.